This is a short film about empty housing in London. According to recent analysis, there are over 20,000 properties left lying empty across London. Of these, over 11,000 have been uninhabited for at least a decade. These are known as ghost houses, often haunting the skies high above the city. In reality, these are not homes at all, but carefully stacked steel and glass greenhouses, in which the rich and the super-rich can cultivate their capital. Over the course of the recent recession, as growth has flatlined and salaries stagnated, these towers of luxury apartments have served as the ridgepoles holding up the fraying canvas of the British economy. To put the number of empty homes into context, between April 2017 and March 2018, the total number of what are called affordable homes that were built was just over 3,300. At the same time, low housing supply in London is blamed for the current housing crisis, which has led to millions of so-called generation rent being stuck in often poor quality, overcrowded conditions that swallow up large portions of their income. So why are so many properties left standing empty for so long? This short film will look at some of the reasons. In 2013, the Shard opened to great fanfare as Europe's first vertical city. Its upper levels include 10 luxury apartments priced at up to £50 million each. 5 years on, all of them remain unsold and empty. When it was completed in 2009, One Hyde Park was billed as the most exclusive address in the world. A 2013 Freedom of Information request found that just 19 out of 80 apartments were permanently occupied, the rest being either empty or second homes. By evening, the streets of Belgravia and Knightsbridge are disconcertingly empty, as though having been annexed off for reasons unknown. In this part of London, 25% of residential properties are empty most of the time. In the West End, it is as high as 40%. But the most prominent example is St George's Wharf on the southern bank of the Thames. Almost 2/3 of the tower's apartments are in foreign ownership, many of them only being used for a fraction of the year. The former Mayor Boris Johnson described these properties as blocks of bullion in the sky, as purchasers understand that London's inflated land values will continue the return on their investments, whether they occupy them or not. This phenomenon has been called buy to leave. Just as buyers at the top end of the market don't want to drive a second-hand Aston Martin, neither do they want to live somewhere that's already been occupied. And yet, according to the Mayor's Homes for Londoners report, the number of empty properties in London is at its lowest level since the 1970s, at 0.6%, a fact that has prompted some to dismiss the issue as being a problem at all. In fact, the same Boris Johnson who described luxury apartments as bullion blocks argued that we should be humbly thanking, not bashing the super-rich for choosing to live, however infrequently, in them. While the principal of Zaha Hadid Architects, Patrick Schumacher, said, "I know a lot of people that have second homes in London, and I'm so glad they do. Even if they're here only for a few weeks and throw some key parties, these are amazing multiplying events."
The representation in the media, I've had like a big problem with it. So for example, we live in London, you know, the Evening Standard is edited by George Osborne, which is a big architect of austerity and, you know, has been involved in this housing crisis that we're in right now, have huge housing development papers in the middle, and I don't know who on the tube is looking at that and thinking I might buy One Hyde Park. And it's so bizarre to think that you're sitting in a city that's kind of building all these things that I don't know who they're for, because they're not for any of the people I know.
Despite slowing sales, there are currently over 400 luxury apartment blocks waiting to sprout up from London's fertile ground. In an environment where rising land values make investing in London real estate one of the safest and most lucrative bets that the sluggish global economy is able to offer, it can be seen as inevitable that the kind of property being brought to market will predominantly be for so few of its inhabitants. So who are the elusive occupants of these ghost houses? A 2016 investigation by The Guardian found that a quarter of the apartments in St George's Wharf are held through secretive offshore companies based in tax havens. Just along the riverbank is Vauxhall 9 Elms, home to the new Dutch and American embassies, and Battersea Power Station, currently being redeveloped into luxury apartments. Upon examination, the estate agent Knight Frank found that nearly 90% of the power station properties were sold to overseas investors. The release of the Panama Papers laid bare the extent to which London has become the global centre for corruption and money laundering, as luxury towers become the filtration devices for cleaning the capital of politically exposed persons from countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Russia and Hong Kong. London has been called the billionaire playground of the world, a name that owes something to the Golden Visa scheme, whereby individuals are able to purchase British citizenship if they invest in UK bonds or shares. While property is exempt, it would seem to follow that these high net worth individuals safeguard their investments by buying into London's property market. Central London real estate was not always so lucrative. In the 1920s and 30s, the new middle class abandoned the Victorian terraces of the inner city for Metroland. Modern semi-detached houses were built to carefully designed plans on greenfield sites that became Greater London suburbia, connected to the centre by newly electrified train lines and buses. Over this period, inner London declined by around 200,000, leaving the working classes to their increasingly problematic slums. In 1971, there were over 23,000 empty properties in London awaiting demolition, some of which had been left derelict since the Blitz. By 1978, many of these had been reclaimed and repaired by an army of between 20 and 30,000 squatters.
"144 Piccadilly. They attempted to defy law and order. They thought they could snub the conventions of decent society when they seized the 60-room mansion and transformed it into hippie house. For a week, several hundred dropouts took up residence. They decided to stay put and meet violence with violence despite an eviction order. There were 73 arrests, but the hippies weren't finished yet. They found another place to dump themselves, a converted office block newly decorated.
Squatting in residential buildings was made illegal in 2013. But despite this, over the last 2 or 3 years, a curious collective known as Autonomous Nation of Anarchist Libertarians, or ANOR for short, have made headline news around the world by occupying some of London's most expensive empty properties. Between January and February 2017, they occupied 102 Belgrave Place, a Grade 2 listed building worth £15 million, and after being evicted, 4 Grosvenor Gardens. By opening them up as makeshift hostels, they have sought to highlight the abundance of property left deserted and unused, in many cases derelict, like Bishop's Avenue in Hampstead, nicknamed Billionaires Row, while homelessness rates continue to rise. In March 2015, the group occupied the vacated Institute of Directors building at 123 Pall Mall. When this made the news, an IOD spokesperson responded, "There are probably still some Adam Smith books left in there, maybe they could learn something." Having said that, it might be worth noting that in his Wealth of Nations, Smith argued that a tax on ground rent would prevent landowners from gaining monopolies, in other words a tax that would recoup profits from rising land values and help keep markets under control. Today it is slums, or sink estates as they are now referred to, that are the prime target for developers seeking to seize large swathes of publicly owned land and capitalise on its ever-growing value. Those who oppose this, and the displacement of the existent community that it necessarily involves, argue that the answer is to renovate those estates, rather than resorting to demolition and regeneration.
As a proportion of the number of homes in each council tax band, the highest percentage, double the national average, was in the very highest, most expensive properties, and the very lowest. And I was trying to think about why that was, and I think to understand that you have to look at why homes are being left empty, like in London. And some of that is about people simply investing in properties purely as commodities for speculation. Some as people buying second homes for their kids, homes for students who are coming out over here, and they tend to be kind of higher level. In the mid-band level, you've got people, a lot of middle-class second homeowners, or simply homeowners who are buying properties because they're making more money from this accumulation on their properties than they are on their actual salary. But down the bottom end, which is kind of the area that interests us, why are so many council homes standing empty? Because there's a large number of those in London. That's a kind of a more complex issue, which isn't about kind of the oligarchs and the foreign speculators coming over here, but about the state regeneration strategy.
A case in point is the former Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle. Around 3,000 council properties were eradicated by the regeneration. When the first phase went on the market in 2016, 100% of the new apartments were sold to foreign investors. The amount of social housing deemed viable for the developers to provide was just 82.
I think a lot of people kind of refer to the Haygate as a kind of a terrible example of estate regeneration. I think it's actually a model of the way estate regeneration increasingly goes.
How many do you think are being occupied at the moment?
Not many. No. But even if they are occupied, they're not contributing to this sort of home-owning democracy that we're meant to be kind of all moving into. They're actually owned as properties for buy-to-let. And that's something which is also producing an increasing number of empty homes.
But home-owning democracy was the vision of Margaret Thatcher, who upon her election in 1979 would bring about a revolution in property policy that for the first time would transform homes into investment vehicles driven by the profit motive, which would define the logic of today's empty housing. During the 1950s and 60s, Labour and Conservative governments had done their best to outdo one another in terms of the number of council houses built, with a total of around 250,000 a year being considered normal. By the time Thatcher left office 11 years later, the number of new council house properties completed had fallen to just over 17,000. When Thatcher took office, her flagship right to buy policy was heralded as a surefire means of transferring wealth to the poorer classes, by giving council tenants the option to buy their homes at very large discounts.
We promise you the right in law to buy your council house at 1/3 below market price. All the time we're trying to be fair.
The Housing Act of 1980 was immediately divisive, with some seeing it as aspirational, creating a new generation of Tory voters and pulling Britain firmly away from the inherent socialism of council housing. Others saw it as the flogging off of public assets for short-term gain. But the critical factor behind the policy was that spending restrictions were placed on councils, preventing them from being able to use the sales revenue to build new housing, thereby replenishing their stock. During the 1980s, 1.24 million council houses were sold off at discounts of between 33 and 50%. In 2016, a House of Commons Select Committee report found that 40% of former council houses sold through Right to Buy were being rented out by the private landlords at a much inflated rate.
Is it not time the government reconsidered its policy of cutting support for council housing in order to bring pressure on council tenants to buy their houses by forcing up council rents?
Speaker, as the honourable gentleman is very well aware, we put through a policy of purchasing council houses by their tenants, a policy which was bitterly opposed by the Labour Party, a policy from which many, many people have profited and are very grateful for that. It has been a very good bargain for all who have partaken of the opportunity they've had from this government.
By removing so much of the capital's land from public ownership and casting it adrift into the new free market economy, the conditions were right for land values to grow to exorbitant heights, which the richest would be able to buy and store as secure investments. But Thatcher's property revolution was to have another unforeseen consequence. Housing benefit, introduced in 1982, began to subsidise people on lower incomes in the private rental sector, shifting away from subsidising supply to subsidising the demand. In 1991, the then Tory Housing Minister Sir George Young said that if people could not afford to pay the market rent, housing benefit will take the strain. Today, billions each year are paid out in housing benefit, which is received by private landlords.
I think many of us now accept that the basic model is flawed, but it's been convenient for successive governments to go along with it. The truth is that housing development will only happen in an environment where you get rising prices, which are creating a better margin for the developers. We know there's large amounts of land is left unoccupied, but people sitting on land banks because it's improving their balance sheets if prices are going up in the meantime. It is not a good model for maximising the number of houses being built of adequate quality. So we do have to change the model, and I think that probably does mean intelligent forms of state intervention. Some of it is local councils having greater freedom to borrow to build, the council housing stock, which is depleted too far, stopping the right to buy, actually, which has done terrible damage at the bottom end of the market.
Not only has it done damage, but the years of Thatcher government, followed by New Labour, who did nothing to try and reverse the trend and actually continued the slow decline of council house building, has severely discredited the very notion of social housing provision being a positive thing. A stark symbol of this was provided in 2014, when Glasgow City Council announced their intention to broadcast the demolition of the lamented Red Road flats as a celebratory spectacle on live television. After a public outcry, the idea was dropped, but still, so were the buildings. Then in June 2017, a very different kind of spectacle shone a renewed and uncomfortable spotlight on the issue of both empty and poor quality housing. The Grenfell Tower fire, which claimed 71 lives, was made even more resonant due to its locality, in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea. As of April 2016, there were 1,652 empty homes listed in this borough. In 28 years, private developers built 4,000 new homes, such as One Hyde Park. The council managed to build just 10. During the Blitz, when families were bombed out of their homes, many upper-class families allowed them to stay in their largely empty properties. In the aftermath of the Grenfell fire, many people, including the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, called for the borough's empty properties to be requisitioned if necessary. Nearly a year on from the tragedy, a considerable number of families are still living in temporary accommodation, awaiting a permanent residence. Stringent though such calls of requisitioning may sound, it's nothing that councils don't actually have the power to do already. The critical factor could instead be a lack of political will.
We also have to look at kind of the government's attitude towards empty property. So one of the first things that the coalition government did when they came in 2010 was to try and change, almost scrap the empty dwelling management orders, which is what councils use to intervene in empty properties after they've been left empty for 6 months. They were, I think, initially trying to scrap the whole thing, but then they changed it to extending it to 2 years. So for 2 years you can't do anything about these empty properties. So coming in 2010, the idea that this was kind of a priority for the government to change this and allow properties to remain empty and then add more rules about whether you can intervene shows that this was the government's attitude towards these properties is not something that's going to be helpful to solving this kind of crisis. And it's not just that, we've got lots of long-term empty houses, and that sort of thing shouldn't be happening at all.
Research by the Liberal Democrats at the start of 2018 found that very few councils are actually using their powers to tackle empty homes, and as a result there are few punitive measures in place to give the super-rich second thoughts about keeping such property empty. To illustrate this point, in 2017 a property in Kensington and Chelsea went on sale for £36 million. The annual council tax due on it is £2,124. The council tax charged on a Band C property in the same borough, such as an average flat, is £826. That's a difference of just £24 a week.
There is a council tax surcharge on empty property or second homes, but I think it could be much more penal and create a real disincentive. I mean, if you had 300% council tax or even more, you could potentially shift a certain amount of this luxury accommodation. I mean, price incentives only work to some extent because some of those people are, the money here is for questionable reasons, or they just see Britain as a safe haven for political risk back home, so a bit of extra tax won't deter them. But if it was tough, then we would get some of that property moved on.
But would tougher measures such as these really have the dramatic impact that so many now recognise as being necessary to arrest the phenomenon of London's empty homes? The surrealism of a city becoming ever fuller of towers standing mostly empty in the face of a reality that sees young people locked into the tyranny of high rents, local communities displaced and homeless numbers rising, is a salient illustration that the housing market in its current form is deeply flawed and will require solutions that are both far-reaching in scope and bold in substance. Is the answer to rapidly accelerate the number of genuinely affordable and council house building across the capital? Or should the priority be to make changes to corporate or property taxation and financial regulation to remove London from its pedestal as the best place for super-rich speculation? Maybe that will be the result of Brexit when it finally arrives in 2019, leading to a slowdown and perhaps even a crash of property prices. Maybe hordes of London's disenfranchised young will rise up in a mass movement of requisitioning and squatting in the innumerable empty apartment towers that stand so far beyond their reach. Perhaps the answer lies in a deeper reassessment of the British attitude to property and home ownership, the prevailing logic that enshrines a culture of ownership tied to property as an investment vehicle to secure one's financial future, even if the issues raised in this film are the result. Whatever the suggestions from either side of the ideological divide, there is a growing consensus, particularly in light of Grenfell Tower, that the situation is not only distasteful but untenable, and that London, which is projected to be home to nearly 10 million people by the middle of the next decade, must be a living city, one in which everyone can stake a fair claim. After all, we did hold such grand aspirations once before.
A nation of homeowners will be self-reliant, independent, and able to do what they want with their own lives in their own home.